Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really significant development. It's all about the recent pause in federal funding for Harvard University.
Yeah, it's a big one. Lots of layers to it.
Definitely. We've gathered quite a bit to get a full picture stuff from Harvard's own website about their massive endowment. News reports from CBS Boston, the Harvard Crimson laying out the specifics of the funding pause, even looked at, Reddit threads to see the online chatter.
And the legal side too, right? The Just Security Litigation Tracker.
Exactly. Crucial context there. So our mission today really is to cut through the noise, understand why the funding's on hold, Harvard's reaction, and the bigger picture implications without getting totally overwhelmed.
Sounds good. Where should we start? Maybe with Harvard's money situation, because understanding that is kind of key to the whole thing.
Good call. Because, it's fascinating how an institution with such huge private resources still interacts so heavily with federal funds.
Right. It's not always obvious how that works.
So looking at Harvard's site, the scale is just, wow. They have this endowment, right? Basically, thousands of donations built up over centuries.
Since the very beginning, yeah.
And for fiscal year 2024, it hit $53.2 billion.
Yeah,
Billion!
It's an almost unbelievable number. And that money isn't just like sitting in a vault. The income it generates is vital.
Totally vital. Their own site says it's more than a third of their yearly revenue. It's their single biggest income source.
Gives you a sense of their financial muscle, doesn't it?
For sure. And where does it go? Well, all over. Just last fiscal year, nearly $750 million in student financial aid and scholarships.
Just huge.
Plus research, libraries, museums. I mean, the list of schools and libraries on their site alone is massive. It shows the sheer scope.
And here's a really important detail about that endowment. Something like 70% of the money paid out each year. It's donor-directed.
Meaning the original donor specified where it has to go.
Exactly. For, specific research or a particular department or student aid with certain rules. So Harvard can't just decide to use all that money differently if, say, federal funding gets cut.
Ah, okay. So that adds a wrinkle. They have limitations.
Definitely. It's not just one giant flexible pot of cash.
Okay, so a very wealthy university, heavily reliant on its endowment, but still significantly involved with federal funding.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the main event. This pause.
Right. The administration's move.
Yeah, reports from CBS Boston, Harvard Crimson, they say the Trump administration halted $2.2 billion in multi-year grants, plus another $60 million in contracts.
Some reports even put the total closer to $2.3 billion. It's a serious amount of money we're talking about.
It really is. And this didn't come out of the blue, apparently. There was a letter first.
A letter laying out conditions Harvard needed to meet to keep that federal funding flowing, or, as they put it, continue their financial relationship.
And the conditions, pretty intense.
Yeah.
Reports mention leadership reforms, stopping DEI policies immediately.
An audit of viewpoint diversity.
Right? Viewpoint diversity among students and faculty. And also meaningful discipline for students involved in that pro-Palestinian encampment.
That viewpoint diversity audit. That's a tricky one, isn't it? What does that even mean in practice?
Exactly. How do you measure something like that? The reports didn't spell out the metrics.
No, but the implication seems to be, checking if there's a wide range of political views represented and maybe respected on campus. In hiring, admissions, what's taught.
It raises all sorts of questions about academic freedom, though.
It absolutely does. And on top of those specific demands, the administration also mentioned a broader review, looking at about $9 billion in grants and contracts overall.
$9 billion. Wow.
Yeah, checking for compliance with federal rules like civil rights obligations. This is tied into those ongoing investigations about alleged anti-Semitism on campuses, too.
And we should probably remember, President Trump had spoken about this before,
Yeah.
right? Threatening to pull funding from universities over protests he called illegal.
Yes, and they did cancel funding for Columbia University over similar issues, allegations about harassment of Jewish students. So there's a pattern here.
It seems like part of a consistent approach, yeah. Not just an isolated thing with Harvard.
Exactly. It reflects this administration view about federal oversight of universities getting taxpayer money, which leads us to Harvard's reaction. How did they respond?
Well, President Alan Garber was pretty direct. He said, look, we've taken steps on anti-Semitism and we'll do more. But he flat out rejected the proposed agreement. Said the conditions were beyond what the federal government has the power to demand.
So pushing back hard on the grounds of institutional independence.
Completely. He stressed their independence, their constitutional rights. He basically said the government was overstepping.
Did he mention the research side? Because that's often where federal funds are crucial.
He did. He highlighted all the federally funded research at Harvard, leading to major breakthroughs,
Yeah.
sort of implying this pause hurts more than just us.
A strategic point to make. Wider impact.
And he got some backup. Jeffrey Flyer, the former Harvard Medical School dean, supported Garber's stance publicly.
Okay.
But the core of Garber's argument, according to the Crimson, was this quote: "No government should dictate what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, and which areas of study they can pursue."
That really sums up their position, doesn't it? Academic freedom versus government control.
It frames it perfectly. Like, accepting these terms would set a really bad precedent.
Okay, so Harvard draws a line in the sand, citing independence. What's the administration's argument back? How do they justify these demands?
Well, their angle, based on the reports, is basically federal money comes with strings attached. It's not a blank check.
The taxpayer money argument.
Right. They argue if Harvard wants federal funds, it has to follow federal rules, specifically anti-discrimination laws, and foster an open environment for different viewpoints.
And that special task force on anti-Semitism probably played a role here, pushing for tougher measures on campuses. Seems likely. The administration frames it as being about fairness, respect, upholding the law, especially given the campus protests and tensions, making sure everyone feels safe.
So less about controlling teaching, more about ensuring a non-discriminatory environment as a condition of funding.
And the legal basis they're leaning on is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, right?
Correct. Title VI prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs getting federal money.
And interestingly, it sounds like both Harvard and the administration agree on that basic principle, no discrimination.
Yeah, the fight isn't really about whether discrimination is bad. It's about how you prevent it and how much power the federal government has to dictate specific policies to a private university to achieve that. That's the core disagreement.
The interpretation and enforcement.
Exactly. So this standoff, what are the potential real-world consequences if this funding pause sticks?
Well, the reports flag some serious potential impacts on research, things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's studies.
Oh, wow, really critical areas. Yeah, and also work in AI, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. The concern is projects could get stalled, delayed, maybe even canceled entirely without that federal support.
And that's huge because federal grants often pay for the researchers, the equipment, the labs. A pause like this could send ripples through the whole research community, not just at Harvard.
Absolutely. Slowing down progress in areas that, frankly, affect all of us. Like you said, Alzheimer's research that impacts families everywhere.
So it really boils down to this fundamental tension. Government oversight tied to funding versus university autonomy and academic freedom. Where is the right line?
It's the central conflict. And this Harvard situation, as you mentioned earlier, it's not happening in a vacuum.
Right.
That just security litigation tracker, it paints a broader picture.
Right. The tracker itself shows how often the administration's actions, especially around funding and regulations, have ended up in court.
Yeah, we're not taking sides on any specific case, obviously, but the tracker lists tons of lawsuits about government grants, actions towards universities, DEI policies.
It shows this isn't a one-off dispute. There's a wider pattern of legal challenges.
And looking at those challenges, you see recurring themes, don't you? Without getting into the weeds of each case.
Definitely. You often see arguments about violating the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA basically, the rules for how government agencies have to act.
So procedural complaints.
Right. And also constitutional arguments, First Amendment free speech, Fifth Amendment due process, separation of powers, and claims that the administration just went beyond the authority Congress gave it.
Seeing those same arguments pop up again and again really suggests Harvard's situation is kind of a symptom of a larger ongoing friction between the government and institutions.
It highlights just how complex and legally fraught that relationship can be.
We also glanced at some Reddit discussions about this, just to get a feel for public reaction.
Oh, yeah. What's the vibe there?
It's really mixed, actually. Some people are pointing at Harvard's huge endowment, like $53 billion. Why do they even need federal money?
The rich university argument.
Exactly. But then others are really worried about government overreach, stepping into academic affairs, what it means for university independence long term.
So the public discussion mirrors the core tensions we've been talking about. Understandable.
Yeah. So wrapping up this deep dive, the key thing is this standoff. Harvard asserting its independence against these federal demands tied to, well, a lot of money.
Billions in research funding, with potentially serious knock-on effects for critical research areas, as we discussed.
Alzheimer's, AI, quantum computing, stuff that matters.
Which really brings us to a final thought, maybe for you, the learner, to chew on. We know public funding for research is vital. We also know academic freedom and institutional autonomy are incredibly important principles.
Right. Two really important things, sometimes in conflict.
So the question is, what do you think the ideal balance is? How do we strike that balance? And looking ahead, what are the long-term consequences if these kinds of conflicts between government and universities become more common? What does that mean for education, for research down the road?
Yeah. No easy answers there. Definitely something to think